1991, the end of July. Dan H. left his small airport in Johnson County, Kansas, and flew a single-engine Cessna, headed for another small airport located in the Ozarks near his weekend retreat, which was located on Table Rock Lake. Dan was a drinker who most of the time did so responsibly. However, as the court records are brimming with examples, there are times when even the most responsible drinker makes the mistake of thinking they are sober enough to do a task which later life proves was not the case. There is no legal proof that Dan had been drinking before getting into his plane and taking off for the Ozarks, but if you talk to those that know him and the couple of people who had a slight few moments of time seeing him before he took off, the story lends credibility to the theory he was drinking or under the influence when the plane went down. It certainly explains his reluctance to contact the local air traffic tower when he realized there was a problem with the plane. The final explanation provided by the investigation stated that the crash was due to some sort of fault in the engine which remains unknown but has been concluded to have something to do with the fuel pump or fuel line that caused the plane to stall and forced the pilot to crash into the trees of the Ozarks in an uninhabited location. When the plane lost power, Dan glided for as far as he could take it, but eventually, of course, the plane lost enough altitude that it hit the tops of the trees. When that happened, the plane flipped over, trapping Dan in the canopy of the trees. It was night and extremely dark all around the plane. However, he had a flashlight and packed survival backpack, which had a pistol and holster which he put on his belt, along with a knife that was in the pack. There was also a flare gun with several flares, some fishing gear, a water purifier, and even a satellite telephone. He dropped the backpack to the ground below and fashioned something he could climb down at least a majority of the way, using the storage straps in the back of the plane. When Dan reached the ground, he had been afraid of landing funny on the backpack he had thrown down. He needed not have worried. The backpack was gone when he landed on the ground. This was a major blow because it had his chance to call for help in it. The radio in the plane had not worked after the crash, but he hadn't tried very hard to get it to work because of the satellite phone. The plane was his best chance of being found by a rescue team, with or without the satellite phone, because it was hanging upside down in the tops of the trees. He decided to set up a camp just outside of the range of the plane falling further down and it landing on him. He figured when it was light, he could figure out if he could or if he would want to climb back up into the plane to see if he could get the radio to work. Truth told, if he could have got back up there right then, he would have done so. He did not relish camping on the ground with whatever it was that took the backpack. Most likely a bear. Just his luck, he had crash landed on top of a bear. The flashlight he had was one of those which had several options, the last one being a low LED that would allow for 72 hours of constant use. Dan switched it over to that setting, which was definitely spookier than the other choices, but he tried to console himself with the knowledge that if he was out there in the dark for 3 days or more, he would at least have some sort of light to use. He used the low beam light to look around the area and gathered as much dry wood as he could find. One good thing about the forests in the Ozarks is they have plenty of dry wood to be found, at least if you are in an area where there's few people ever go. The area did not have the best of odors. That was the first thing noticeable about the location. It reeked like skunk and possibly something else which was very musky, very wild, and offensive to the human nose. Next was the sounds. He was hearing some really strange noises. There were several noises which caused him to worry, but none more than this occasional deep guttural set of grunts which might have been a conversation, but he didn't recognize the language. In the process of gathering the dry wood for a fire, he heard the sound of what he was pretty sure was his backpack being torn to pieces. Then some more grunts and a growl, which might have been a warning from one creature to another that they should leave the food found in the backpack alone, that it was already spoken for. He didn't hear the roar until after he had started the fire. It might have been a response to the fire, and it might have been just coincidence. In any case, not long after he got the fire started, there came a roar which Dan thought came from whatever was the king of the forest. If there was anything out there more powerful than the thing that made that roar, he sure did not want to meet it. In fact, he didn't want to meet what had made that roar. Dan was already bruised and scratched all over from his landing. He had allowed himself to lay down next to the fire he just got started and was hoping to get some rest when that roar made him sit straight up and get his gun out. He kept his flashlight in the off position but had it in his hand, ready to flick it on at the brightest setting so he could aim the gun and fire it in the direction of the light beam. All he needed to do was to hear the sound of something coming at him, and he would first light them up with the flashlight, and then he'd fill them full of bullets. The roaring continued, and things got to the point where Dan felt like if he didn't leave the area that he was going to be rushed, and then worse. So he left his campfire and moved through the forest in the darkness with only his flashlight to provide illumination. And whatever was out there had come with him. He was moving blindly in the forest, probably in circles, because he lost track of his effort to stay in a straight line. Something was moving at him through the brush over and over. Just when he would expect something to come into view, it would disappoint him. Twice, out of frustration, he fired the gun. He had extra ammunition, so he wasn't afraid of wasting ammunition, but part of him was afraid if he did hit something, it would piss them off to the point they would stop playing with him and just charge him. Regardless, he lost his cool and fired the gun twice in the direction of the noises. This caused him to get bombed with rocks. He considered shutting off the flashlight so not to give away his location, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. As such, he endured a constant barrage of the rocks. Some of them were of good size, but the bigger ones he managed to miss, so he had some luck. At some point, Dan fell asleep. The first hints of morning came filtering through the leaves, waking Dan to his circumstances. He woke up stiff and even more sore than he had been right after dropping out of the plane. He noticed he was bloody with scratches he had done to himself while charging through the forest in the dark. He found his feet, and the first thing he did was to figure out which way was north by using the direction the sun rose. Concluding which direction was north was not a lot of help. Yes, it gave him some feeling of regaining control of his life, but that was about all. He could be sure what part of the Ozarks he had crashed. In the end, he decided his best choice of action was to try and move in the direction which he thought was where the plane had crashed. Maybe the rescue and search team would find the plane. He had a backup plan that if he came upon a stream, he was going to abandon the plan to find the plane and instead follow the stream because at some point he knew it would kick him out where he could find a road. The other logic he attached to the decision was he would be where he would have water. He would always be going downhill, so his calorie use would be much less than if he were trying to go uphill or even if he were moving at a lateral direction. He came upon the plane first. After seeing the footprints, however, he had plenty of motivation to keep moving. He either didn't see them last night or perhaps they weren't there until after he had left the area. They were nearly twice the size of his shoes, and of course they were bare feet prints. If shoes were made that big, they were for basketball players. The problem was that these footprints were also really wide, too, and they did not appear to be the feet of an athlete. They looked exactly like the prints you see of Bigfoot. Once there were not just the big prints. There were prints of several sizes. That was just of what he was able to see, too. He felt like he must have crashed right on top of a group of Sasquatch. Do you call the group of them a tribe? What did they call a group of gorillas? He thought maybe it was a troop. The word band came to mind also, but he thought that was probably meant more towards the guerrillas that were small armed units than that battled larger units of armed forces. While he allowed his mind to ponder the subtle differences, he used the rest of his mind to do the things he needed to do to get out of there in as efficient a manner as possible. The first thing he did was to start moving downhill away from the crash. He realized this cut down his chances of stumbling upon a stream by a considerable amount. In fact, if he wanted to find a stream, he was going to have to cut across the slope of the mountain until he came to the stream. He could then move downhill following the path of the stream because it was the best chance at finding his way out of the forest. But what he figured to be noon, he was getting pretty thirsty. It was frustrating because the forest had plenty of moisture nearly everywhere, but none of it was something he could drink. If you turned over a leaf, it was wet underneath. The evidence of moisture was just everywhere. It was very frustrating and acted as a constant reminder of what he wanted and couldn't have. Dan finally came upon the remnants of a stream. In other words, it would be full of water again after it rained, but this was one of those streams which was only full of water when there was runoff. July had seen all the water that was running off the tops of the mountains to have made its way down. There were streams which would remain empty until fall unless there was a rogue thunderstorm to come through the area. Regardless, it was still a stream, which may be not supplying water. It still was a good chance to eventually take him to a road. Dan realized he was probably lucky he hadn't had the chance to get water because as soon as he did drink some, he was likely to get sick. He didn't have anything to boil the water in, so he would have to drink it as it was found. At least by not having found any, he wasn't teased into drinking. He had a feeling something was watching him. It had been with him since he left the plane. Did he pick up another damn Sasquatch? He had to assume as much. Well, he still had his pistol, and he was a long ways from giving up. Mid-afternoon, Dan came upon a stream. It hooked into the empty stream he had been following. Actually, it was the other way around, or it looked that way anyhow. In any case, the two streams merged, and he found actual water. He was powerful thirsty, but he knew better than to drink from the water. How long he could go before giving in to the thirst was another question. He was approaching somewhere in the middle of, well, he knew it had been a long time. It never occurred to him that when you get short of water, you get short of thinking as well. Still, at that point, he was refraining from drinking, so he continued on. Now at least he had a stream with water in it to follow. There hadn't been any sort of harassment from the Sasquatch, if that was indeed what was following him. There are mountain lions in the Ozarks, and probably a few black bear. He felt like if there was something following him, that it was more than just a mountain lion or a black bear. The shadow of the mountain soon began to overtake him. There was still probably 2 or 3 hours before darkness, but he was already in the shadows. It made travel through the forest seem spooky. Dan was desperate for a place to camp for the night. He needed some place where he wouldn't have to watch all sides. He kept moving, and then he came upon an area which had lots of sticker bushes. He decided the area would provide his best safety for the night, so he carefully worked his way into the bushes while he could still see. Using his knife and pistol, he was able to cut enough of the sticker bushes out so he could lay down and not be suffering their punctures. He had cut his way into the growth the same manner he positioned himself so he was aimed toward the direction he had come into the thicket. If anything tried to come after him, the easiest way would be to follow the path he had cut in, so that was the direction he was prepared for any attack to be borne. Morning came, and Dan realized he had slept through the night and not had any harassment from the Sasquatch. He would figure out later that that was simply respect for the sticker bushes, and they did not choose to enter the area after him. At first he thought he was rid of their attention. He climbed back out of the thicket, and when he arrived at the creek, he gave in and drank some of the water. At least it was running water. He began to follow the water, but soon realized he wasn't the only one moving through the forest. Once again he heard the sounds of something tracking him. It was so obvious at one point the other was also moving. It stopped moving a step after Dan stopped. It was not well hidden from whatever was tracking him was following. Then it occurred to Dan perhaps that was the goal. If so, it was staggeringly effective. Hunger was finally an issue. All those calories spent, his stomach was ready for something, but he knew he was a long way from that being satisfied. The worst of everything was that he couldn't see his goal. There seemed to be nothing but trees as far as he could see, which admittedly wasn't that far. Occasionally he would come to a spot which allowed him to overlook the upcoming territory, but he never saw a road or anything resembling civilization. Then, mid-part of the second day, he was in the forest. He heard a helicopter go flying by, but he was under too much canopy to have any chance of being seen. It provided encouragement, if nothing else. He had drank from the stream again, and so far had not felt sick, which was some sort of a blessing. Dan kept moving and seeing more of the same. It was coming on the night again, and he was desperate to find some place he could feel safe from the creature following him when he stumbled upon an acre carved out of the forest where there was a house. It had a pickup truck parked outside it, and there was a driveway which hinted to the possibility there was an actual road somewhere not too far in the distance. 2 kids played in the yard with a hound dog and a cat. Dan was never so happy to see signs of civilization. He was so happy to find a house he forgot how he looked, which was cause for concern for the homeowners, Jacob and Mary Anderson. They had 2 kids, a boy named Alex and a girl named Lucy. After Dan proved he wasn't dangerous by handing over the pistol to Jacob, the family relaxed and invited him into their home. Understand, it was nearly dark by then. They ate dinner together, and after they sat down in the living room, but were soon surprised by a loud whack on the side of the house. Obviously, it was a big rock, and obviously the Sasquatch had followed Dan to their house. Dan couldn't apologize enough for bringing this attack upon their house, but when he calmed down, he noticed that Jacob had went into the bedroom and came back out with a rifle. He said he'd be just a minute. He went outside the house and fired off 2 shots. He hollered something that Dan couldn't make out, and then there was walking back into the door. He said they wouldn't have any further trouble, and they did not. The next day, Dan was given a ride into the local township where he reported the plane crash and was met with investigators. On the ride into town, he asked Jacob about the creatures. Jacob said they had been a part of the landscape for as long as he remembered, having grown up in the area. He said they were basically just curious, but sometimes they got a little braver and would come closer to the house. That night was the first time anything had been thrown at the house in a long time. It might have been the action of a juvenile that didn't know any better. Jacob said usually they would go away when he got the rifle out. He said they hadn't lived there all that time without enduring some damage from the Sasquatch. Apparently you had to keep a close eye on your farm animals, especially dogs. Cats were also prone to come up missing, but dogs seemed to be a favorite. Their current pets stayed in the house with them at night. Naturally, Dan was extremely grateful to the family, and he promised to stop in from time to time and give them free dental service, or at least what he could do without having them into the office. Thank you for visiting. Please subscribe and like. It is appreciated. Godspeed to all.